Good day, everyone. Today is December 11th, 2019. I'm your host, Mike Lasecki, for today's webinar. Our topic today is Impact Evaluation: Why, What, and How. Before I proceed to the announcements, just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and you'll automatically receive a link to the recording. Please use the chat window today. We're going to be asking a lot of you, and we want to hear our questions hear your questions in the chat window as well. As we begin, we'd like to thank ATE Central, the information hub for the National Science Foundation's ATE program. They've made this webinar possible through their webinar hosting service. Thanks, ATE Central. The webinar is brought to you by Evaluate. Evaluate is the evaluation hub for the ATE program. Evaluate advances evaluation in the ATE community by offering trainings, cultivating a network, researching emerging topics, and collecting data about the ATE program. Be sure to check out the Evaluate website, which you can see at the bottom of the screen there. The materials, the slides for this webinar are already posted on Evaluate's website. If you want to open another browser, you could get them right now. You can download them. There are several other resources around impact evaluation that are featured there as well. As I mentioned, the recording will be available within a couple of days and will be emailed to you. You can see a link in the chat window. Thank you, Anna. Let me introduce myself again. I'm Mike Lasecki with Luca Partners. I'll be the moderator for the webinar today. And Lisa Wilson-Betcher will be the main presenter from Evaluate for this webinar. She works at Evaluate, which is located at the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University. Now let's acknowledge the behind-the-scenes folks who have made a lot of contributions to the production today. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see Lori Wingate, Anna Council, Emma Lieberg, Kelly Robertson, and Val Marshall. They're all with the Evaluate team. Thanks for your help there. Cynthia Williams is with Style Sheets, and she's the editor to make sure every word is perfect in this webinar. And then joining me at Luca Partners is Janet Pinhorn and Janet Payne. Thanks, everyone, for being part of the preparation of this webinar. This webinar is designed for individuals funded by the NSF's ATE education program. We call that ATE for short. But of course, impact evaluation also applies across a much larger community as well. So welcome, everyone. Now back to that ATE program, which is focused on improving technician education, mainly through two-year colleges. It funds projects in high-tech areas like advanced manufacturing, engineering technologies, IT, nano, things like that. Now is a good opportunity to say that the views expressed in this webinar are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. And now I'll turn things over to Lisa. Welcome, Lisa. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Mike. And hello, everyone. So again, my name is Lisa, and I'm excited to be here with you today to talk about impact evaluation. So to give you a quick overview of the webinar today, we have three main sections interspersed with activities and question breaks. So first, we're going to talk about what impact evaluation is and what sets it apart from other types of evaluation approaches. Second, we're going to talk about determining causality. And finally, we're going to dive into some practical strategies for carrying out impact evaluations. So you can see that we have two question breaks, like Mike mentioned. So if at any point throughout the webinar you think of a question, make sure to write it in the chat window, and Mike will queue it up for the upcoming question break. So by the end of this webinar, we don't expect you to be an expert on impact evaluation, but we hope that you're better equipped to have informed conversations with your project staff or your evaluator, and we can create this shared understanding of what it really means to conduct an impact evaluation. So we do want you to be engaged throughout the webinar. So to prepare, there is a fair amount of interaction throughout the chat window, which is on the right side of your screen. So to start off, we want to get your brain synapses firing. Take a look at these three pieces of evaluative evidence. So after reading them, determine which of these pieces of evidence you find the most compelling of a project's success, and share your response in the chat window. And then add a why you would choose that piece of evidence. So again, which statement is most compelling of a project's success and why? So I see a number of people have put B in there, someone put C, So while you're writing B, why B? What kinds of reasons? So Lou says that B shows actual impact of program activities. Let's see, some people are asking for more context. I understand this is a quick example here just to show a point. But we do see some people saying that it should, improved knowledge and performance because B gets to the change that the program really wants to see. That's a great answer, Debbie. Yeah, definitely. So these are all great responses. And I know when I ask a question like this, I hear a lot of people thinking critically about the merit of each of these statements and why they might be important in different contexts and to different stakeholders. But many who are looking at a project from a macro perspective think like funders, like NSF or foundations, college administrators. They really want to determine the overall merit and they would argue that B is the most convincing to them. So this piece of evidence goes beyond whether 1,500 participants utilized the material or whether the participants were satisfied. So like everyone was saying in the chat, it really gets to how the project is making a difference. So evaluative finding B, evidence that students who are using the new materials are 3 times more likely to pass the licensing exam, is really looking at the impact of a project and its activities. So let's talk more about what we mean by impact. So you've most likely heard the term impact used in a lot of different situations, referring to a lot of different things. And I want to get us all on the same page today so that we can have a shared understanding of what we're referring to when we say impact evaluation. So an impact evaluation has a few key characteristics that really set it apart from other evaluation approaches. So first, impact evaluation measures the long-term effects of a project's activities. So we're not talking about measuring immediate activity counts or outputs. We're thinking about the project and its results from a macro perspective here. Second, impact evaluation attends in some way to causality and the project's role in bringing about those effects. So we're going to talk about this more in depth, but attention to causality is one key feature of an impact evaluation. So as we'll discuss, this can look like a number of different ways depending on stakeholder preferences, assumptions, and the resources that are available. And finally, impact evaluation assesses intended and unintended impacts. So sometimes we find that evaluations are rather goal-based, meaning that all the criteria they measure really come from project documents outlining intended effects of the activities. But we also find that there are other various unintended effects of a project, both positive and negative, that are investigated within an impact evaluation. So I want to take a moment to unpack some terminology. So I've heard a lot of confusion around the differentiation between outcomes and impact. So if you've had the question differentiating these two concepts, I want you to know that you are not alone, and that a side effect of evaluation's transdisciplinary nature is really that we have a lot of vocabulary that doesn't always have shared meaning between different groups of people. So let's look at the definition of outcomes and impacts from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD. So the OECD defines outcomes as the likely or achieved short-term and medium-term effects of an intervention's outputs. Then they define impact as positive and negative, primary and secondary, long-term effects produced by a development intervention, directly or indirectly, and intended and unintended. So while we can tease out some differences in these definitions, you'll notice that neither of them identify a specific time frame. So both definitions use words like short, medium, and long-term effects, but without more specific operationalizations of those. So what we can tell is that on a timeline, outcomes come first while impacts come second. But there's no clear definition or defined distinction for when an effect changes from being an outcome to an impact. And the length of time to see the effects is really dependent on the context, the length, and the intention of the project. So all of this to say, it's really important to identify what you're referring to in evaluation proposals, plans, reports, even just conversations, because not everyone has a shared understanding between the difference between outcomes and impacts. But throughout this webinar, we are going to be focusing on impacts. So again, think the long-term effects of a project. But what do we really mean by long-term? That really varies with context. Well, if we're looking at an ATE project, we generally see that grants last between 3 and 4 years. Therefore, we wouldn't really expect to see any impacts of the project until perhaps halfway through year 3 and beyond, even to the end of the grant, which would be, year 5 or 6. So this can certainly pose a challenge for those who are interested in evaluating the impacts of an ATE program, but who only have funding for 4 years, right? So think carefully about why you might choose to do an impact evaluation and the time, money, and data that it will require. So I want to talk about a case example. So in this hypothetical ATE project called Cybersecurity for All, this is at an equally hypothetical school, the Wood Hollow Community College. And so faculty there noticed a labor demand in the cybersecurity sector and a lack of workforce diversity there. So even as cybersecurity is one of the fastest growing disciplines, the cybersecurity workforce is only 10% women and 12% Black and Hispanic combined. So seeing this need in the labor force, Cybersecurity for All offers workplace-based learning opportunities to underrepresented students with the goal of increasing employment of Black, Hispanic, and female students in the area of cybersecurity. So this project really aims to foster inclusion and retention in cybersecurity programs at the college to increase diversity in cybersecurity students with credentials and eventual employment in the field. And then overall, in the long term, the increased diversity of the cybersecurity workforce intends to help improve national security. So this type of description is something that we might find in a proposal or a project abstract. So let's really map this onto a timeline so we can determine what would be the intended impacts of a project. So the primary activity of this project is to provide internships opportunities to students. So we would expect to see those during the first year or two starting up in the program. Following the project's intended logic, students who participate in the internship opportunities would really be interested in the cybersecurity field and hopefully go on to complete their credentials in cybersecurity. So here we could look at the hopeful increase of Black, Hispanic, and female students receiving credentials in cybersecurity at the college. But the project wants to go beyond students receiving credentials. They want them to be employed and working in the cybersecurity sector. After all, diversifying the cybersecurity workforce was the intentional motivation for the project. So we might not expect to see these project's effects until year 4 or 5 of the projects when students have moved through the program and received employment. And then finally, the project theorizes that in the long run, the increased diversification will help to improve national security, but we wouldn't really expect to see any measurable change in that for quite some time after the program. So if we were to focus our evaluation of this project on assessing just the project activities, this would really be considered a process evaluation. We would be evaluating the processes and the inner workings of the project, what's working well, what's not working well. Whereas if we really focused our data collection on the employment and potentially credentials received, then we'd be looking at the impact of the project. So one should ask questions about whether you should ask questions about process or impact as part of the project is determined by a combination of the stakeholder information needs for decision making and the resources available to the evaluation. And it's certainly possible for process and impact questions to be integrated into the same evaluation. So to help differentiate between process questions and impact questions, let's look at some examples of evaluation questions. So for each of these questions, use the chat box to indicate whether you think they are about process or impact. All right, so let's look at the first question. To what extent did the demographics of those placed in internships match those of the target population? So I see people typing. So we have some that say it's a process question, some that say it's an impact question. So what do you think? Put it in the chat window. So I'm seeing a lot of process. Yeah, so I think process really makes sense to me for this question because you're matching the demographics. You're saying, is this project serving who they intended to serve? Definitely. All right, let's look at another question. To what extent did the number of students credentialed in cybersecurity change because of the project activities? Is this a process question or an impact question? So I see a fair number of people saying impact. Someone said both, Alan. Yeah, interesting. So I would really say that this evaluation question is focused on the impact of the project because it's really asking what happened after students participated in the program and was that change a cause, a symptom, an effect of the project itself. I think this one is our last question. So to what extent were students satisfied with their internship experience? Is this question about satisfaction a process question or an impact question? I see both process, output and process. Yes, I know, right? We skipped the output as an option here. We're just talking about process and impact at the moment. But yeah, I think I would really label this as a process question because it's really not the intended impact. It's not the why this program is really there. It's not really there to satisfy students, but to get students into employment, into the cybersecurity field, right? So the idea of whether or not they're satisfied with their internship probably has implications as to whether they're going to continue in the program or continue on the career path of cybersecurity. But I don't think it necessarily is determined as a long-term impact. All right. Oh, there are more questions here. Let's do one more, and then I think we'll probably skip the final one. So this final question, to what extent were business partners sufficiently engaged in creating internship opportunities? Is this a process or an impact question? Yeah, so I see a lot of people saying process. Yeah, I would agree. Because again, we're talking about how are business and industry partners engaged in creating these different opportunities. All right, so we're going to pause here. I know I've seen some questions go into the chat window, so I'm going to hand it over to Mike and see what questions everyone has.
Thank you, Alyssa. That was a lot of fun interacting on that process impact question. So here's a follow-up question from one of our attendees. Can user satisfaction ever be considered impact?
Yes, and I think this is, one of the things when we were talking about what counts as a short-term, medium-term, long-term impact or outcome, right? And it really does depend on the context of the project. So, and if you only have a year to evaluate something, maybe the longest effect you can look at is satisfaction. But I would challenge you to think, is that really the intended impact of the project, right? Like, is the end goal of this intervention that you're evaluating, is it about just satisfaction? If it is, great. But I wonder if there's something beyond satisfaction that they would be hoping to look at. And that's what I would challenge you to say is the real impact of that intervention.
That makes a lot of sense. Here's a second question for you. You talked about those timeframes for impact. Is a long-term outcome synonymous with impact?
And that's why I wanted to bring up those definitions from the OECD, because unfortunately there is not a clear distinction between long-term outcome and impact. People use them, to be honest, interchangeably and different, which is why I do really think that you need to be clear when you are talking about either outcomes or impacts, but also ask people follow-up questions as to what they're referring to. There is differing approaches called outcome evaluations and impact evaluations. So depending on what context you're in, depending on who you're talking to, they might be asking for something very specific, particularly around attribution or causality, which we'll talk about in the next section. But it's always good to follow up with them to say, when you say outcomes evaluation or you say impact evaluation, what exactly are you looking for?
Well, thank you, Alyssa. That actually addresses another question. You just handled it. Is there a distinction between outcome evaluation and impact evaluation? So thanks for clarifying that. Here's a question. It's a harder one. If you look at that long range, like that in your graph, there was that 6-year impact for national security. That is so far beyond the range of the project. It's probably only funded for, let's say, 3 or 4 years. So what's the point of even thinking about it if it's beyond that? I mean, how does one put that in their mind?
I think that's a challenge for a lot of projects, both ATE and outside of the ATE context, is the fact that the impact that our intervention is intending is really outside of the scope of what the intervention is funded for and the evaluation is funded for. So I hope that when we talk about the practical strategies later on in this webinar, it can get you thinking about different strategies to implement that start you down the road to impact, right? So maybe you can't measure the end-all be-all hopeful impact because that might be 5 years, 10 years down the road. That might be
Sure.
something that needs to be funded separately as a retrospective evaluation that looks back on historic data of the project.
Good point, Lisa. Thanks. Why don't we go forward into the balance of your presentation? Timing's looking good, so thanks for pausing to take those questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for all of your questions. So let's take a deeper dive into the second characteristic of what impact evaluations are. So that's the fact that these evaluations are attentive to causality. So what do we really mean when we say that? Well, when we say causality, we're really talking about a cause and effect relationship, right? So something happens in a project, for example, some of the activities that were addressed in some of the process questions that we were just discussing, and then those activities have an effect, right? They have an impact. So this relationship can be thought about in a very straightforward fashion, where the cause is the single and primary explanation for the effect. So we call this causal attribution. But we also know that, particularly when we look at social programs, that there are multiple things at play that can really explain the effect that we're looking at. So when we recognize that this more complex type of causal structure, we call this causal contribution. So most ATE projects are in the realm of causal contribution because the impact that they're trying to make may have a number of different causes in addition to the project. So how does one go about determining causality? Well, there are 3 requirements that an evaluator or a project staff or a grant specialist should really pay attention to in order to make a strong argument for causality, either causal attribution or causal contribution. So these are good to understand whether you're an evaluator designing an evaluation, a grant writer writing a proposal, or project staff preparing data for an evaluation. So first, there needs to be temporal precedence between the cause and effect. So this simply means that the potential cause happened before the effect happened. So here in this cartoon, we see someone prematurely celebrating, saying, "Thanks to our program, unemployment is down." And then his colleague points out that those numbers were actually collected before the program launched. So per this first requirement of causality, their program could not have possibly been the cause for the reduction in this employment. So the second requirement, there must be covariation between the cause and effect, meaning that when and where the potential cause is present, so is the effect. And when and where the potential cause is absent, the effect is also absent. So there are a lot of things that can look like a causal relationship if you take into account these 2 requirements. So I want to show you an example of a short video to illustrate this. So give us a moment while we switch over the screens. Wonderful. All right. I'll go ahead and press play. Oh, it paused on my end. All right, so in this short video, we see a subway train is pulling into the station at full speed. We have our friend here getting ready with chalk on his hands. So he runs up beside the train. And he seems to stop it. So wow, he must really be strong to stop a train single-handedly, right? The man was there before the train, confirming temporal precedence of cause and effect, and then when he pulled on the train, it stopped. And here we see him getting ready to start the train up again, and there he goes. So here we see the covariation of his actions in the stopping and starting of the train again. So we'll go back to our slides now. So thanks for that video. So things like this really bring into mind the often cited phrase, correlation is not causation, right? So while sometimes events seem to be align with in a way that make it seem like one is influencing another, we really need to be more critical in determining what is the true underlying relationship of the relationship. So hence we have our third requirement. So to make a strong argument for causation, evaluators need to show that there are no plausible alternative explanations, meaning that there's nothing else that really could have explained that effect. So I'm sure we could all list some alternative explanations to why that train started and stopped in the last video that didn't have anything to do with the gentleman on the station. But let's look at another great example that's often used to illustrate this idea. So this graph shows that as ice cream sales rise, so do crime rates. So we might make an incorrect statement that more ice cream causes more crime. However, we know from our third requirement that we need to look for some alternative explanations. So we might look at a graph like this that says, temperature really rises between April and August. And it seems logical that rising temperatures would lead to an increase in ice cream sales, but we actually also know from research that warmer weather also leads to more crime. So the rise in temperature is actually explaining both the rise in ice cream sales and crime. So this is certainly an oversimplified example of how alternative explanations could work. There are many other factors you would want to look at to describe the rates of crime in this example. So here we have an overview of our three requirements for determining causality: temporal precedence, covariation of the cause and effect, and that there are no plausible alternative explanations. So knowing the concepts behind causality are great, but how can these three requirements really show up within our evaluation designs in order to make a strong argument for causality? So to illustrate, we're going to use this Cybersecurity for All case example that we discussed earlier. And specifically, we're going to focus on evaluating the impact of increasing employment in the cybersecurity sector for underrepresented students. So I want to look at three separate evaluation scenarios, which all use different strategies to address the question of causality. So first, we're going to look at an experimental design. I jumped ahead. First, we're going to look at an experimental design, which you may be familiar with even if you're not an evaluator. Second, we're going to look at a scenario which calls for logical reasoning. So this is kind of like a patchwork approach that uses logic to create a case for causality. And finally, the third one is a scenario where we ask participants to directly identify the impact that the project is making. So this is more of a qualitative approach to impact evaluation. And I want to point out that we are intentionally modeling different ways of designing an impact evaluation without advocating one approach or one point of view over the other. So while we discuss each of these scenarios, I want you to keep in mind what you think are the strengths and weaknesses of each of these strategies, because at the end of each scenario, we're going to stop and we're going to discuss. So hopefully this gets you thinking about what might work in your situation, given your stakeholders, your data, and your resources. All right, so for our first scenario, let's look at an experimental design. So like I said, some of you may be familiar with this approach, but what we would do from the start is from all of our cybersecurity students, we would identify those that are eligible to participate in the program, namely Black, Hispanic, and female students. From there, we would randomly select 50 of those students. And then we would take these 50 randomly selected students and assign them to two separate groups. So one group would receive internships and fully participate in the project activities. We would call this group the treatment group, while the other group would not participate in the project, called the control group. So after 3 years, we would compare the employment rates in cybersecurity between students in the two different groups. So if the employment rate in cybersecurity were higher for the groups who participated in the project, we would have a strong argument that Cybersecurity for All did in fact increase employment rates for participating students. So we want to make sure that we check off all of the requirements for determining causality in this scenario, right? So we know that students participated in the project activities before the intended effects of receiving employment, so temporal precedence is checked. we can see that there is a covariation between cause and effect based on the different employment rates in the groups. So covariation of cause and effect is checked off. And the experimental design actually addresses alternative explanation in its random selection and assignment processes. So we're assuming that since students were randomly assigned to the two different groups, that the only difference between those groups should be their involvement in the project or their receipt of the internships. So this leads us to believe that the internship was the only plausible cause for the difference in employment. So here's where I want to pause briefly to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of this type of design. So if you have thoughts on why you might want to use this type of design in your evaluation, share them in the comment box. So what do you think are the strengths of using an experimental design for an impact evaluation? So Sue says, people are more familiar with this model. Yeah, definitely. I think, there's a lot of people out there who think that this is the model, right? They talk about randomized control trials as being the gold standard. Holly Ann mentions that this meets what works clearinghouse requirements. Definitely, depending on what type of environment you're working in, the stakeholders may have assumptions that say these are the types of designs you need to use for your impact evaluation. Paul points out that it's really hard to control randomized assignment conditions in the real world, right? Because maybe you assigned some students to receive internships, but they dropped out or they didn't, or some students in the no internship group, maybe they got internships not throughout this program. Definitely, so there's some bleed over between those groups. So we're getting into some weaknesses, right, which is good too. So I see, warning, there are ethical issues to randomized control trials. Yes, definitely, I agree, right? I think talking about the ethical considerations, legal considerations, feasible and practical considerations, right? This idea of are you taking away internships from certain students and what are the ethical implications of that? There's certainly a lot of real-life situations in which an experimental or even a quasi-experimental design just doesn't really fit, right? Furman, I completely agree. He pointed out that no method is completely perfect. Yes. So this approach of an experimental design really does have strengths, right? There are a lot of stakeholders out there that place a lot of weight on this type of design. There is really strong statistical validity with this type of design. But there are definitely weaknesses, right? We talked about the feasibility of random selection and assignment. Perhaps I missed it, but another issue with this is actually low student number counts, right? So I said that we chose 50 cybersecurity students. I mean, I know a lot of community colleges that wouldn't necessarily have access to that many students at a time. Some other issues are just like not knowing about why there are differences in here, right? So just because it looks at the impact from this quantitative point of view, we don't really know the nuts and bolts of what's going on behind the program, which is why you might considering pairing it with some process evaluation questions as well. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I love all of the active engagement in the chat window. So let's go ahead and move on to our second scenario. So we're calling this scenario a logical analysis. So in this situation, we don't have access to the students or the time to create a control or a comparison group to look across. So instead, we're going to examine the underlying logic of the program. So in this design, evaluators are acting like detectives, right? So they're looking for clues in causal links in order to build the strongest case that they can. So first, the evaluator and project staff would really carefully build a logic model, which would identify project activities, short-term outcomes, and the intended impacts of the project. Then the evaluation would look to see whether or not the project data matches this program theory. So we would start off by looking at whether or not the activities happened in the way that they were intended to happen, right? So for in our case, how many internships were offered? How many students participated in those internships? Were the students primarily Black, Hispanic, or female? If some of these things didn't actually happen in the way they intended to happen, well, then we already have some weak links in our causal argument for this project. Next, we would want to look at the short-term outcomes. So we might expect to see general satisfaction with the internship placement, maybe an increased interest in cybersecurity, maybe even increased networking or mentoring within the field. So all of these things would be considered in-between steps before reaching the intended impact according to the project logic. And finally, the evaluation would look at the impact data it has access to. So for example, we would expect to see increased credentialing rates in cybersecurity, even if we didn't have access to student employment data. So if all of this data are aligning with the project's logic model, we're really beginning to build a solid argument for causality. But we also want to ask about whether the timing makes sense. So similar to our first requirement of whether the cause came before the effect, we want to make sure that the impact didn't occur before the cause or unrealistically quickly afterwards. So we would want to check whether timing is logical relative to other possible causes and whether the impact further downstream in the logic model occurred out of sequence. So if we plotted our employment data for students in the project from years 2 to 6, we saw a trend that looks something like this. We might initially get excited. We might want to claim that our project has increased employment. But if we look at trend data from before the project, we might realize that there's a general upward trend in employment. And that makes sense given that we know that cybersecurity is a growing field. So if this was our data, we would have a hard time attributing the effects of student employment increase to our project. However, what if the previous data looks something like this? Little increase until the start of the project. This makes a stronger argument about the impact of the project because the increase really only started after the project activities were started. Finally, we need to consider whether or not there are alternative explanations for the employment increase. So we might start by looking at the regional cybersecurity employment rate. So if overall employment in the area is increasing, we would expect to see employment increasing for students in our project as well. So meaning that the increase would not be due to our project, right? But if instead the general employment data looks something like this, then we're back to having a stronger argument for the project's impact on employment. So looking at trend data for alternative explanations is really important to consider when trying to interpret or make claims about evaluation data. And this is particularly important to consider when looking at student enrollment data per se, especially because we know that the national trend is declining enrollment rates for community college. So let's check our 3 requirements for causality in this scenario. So first we compared the project data to the logic model to ensure that the intended events align with the project theory and that they were in the correct order. So this confirms temporal precedence. So then we confirmed that the employment only started trending upward after the project activities were in full swing. So this shows a covariation of the cause and effect. And finally, when we looked at alternative explanations, for example, we looked at the trend data for regional cybersecurity employment. So this checks off all 3 of our causal determination requirements. So let's pause again here to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of this approach. So in the chat window, share what you think might be a strength of this strategy. Looks like there's a lot of great conversation that went on. Well, I was talking. I can't catch up on all of it right now, but I'm so glad it's there. So June says that this is fairly easy to implement. Yeah, I think this is something that a lot of people tend to collect data on already and can go back and look at the trends. Jacqueline says it's really practical. And Amanda says it's less expensive to implement. Yes, I think that that's one of the biggest strengths of this approach over an experimental design is that it just costs less resources, right? And resources, I mean money, I mean time, I mean, personnel, power. I also mean just general access to data as well. Let's see, Paul says showing a trend over many years, more than 2 years, is a relatively strong trend. Yeah, so I mean, if we can show data over years, particularly looking before the project as well as after the project. What are some weaknesses of this approach? So I know before we had talked about some stakeholders like What Works Clearinghouse requiring an experimental or quasi-experimental design approach. So this might not necessarily fit. Debbie says that could be difficulties due to equivalent groups. Certainly, finding that comparison might be different. Judy has a really good point that this approach assumes that the logic modeling is correct, for sure. And we kind of skipped over that. It's important to make sure that when you're building that project logic, because you're going to compare the data back to that your logic is really based on a sound foundation of evidence in previous research. Philip says there may have been other changes going on outside of the project. Yeah, and well, we said that we looked at plausible alternative explanations. We really only looked at one here. And in reality, you would want to look at as many as you possibly could. But back to the idea of constrained resources. Depending on the time and money that you have available, you might not be able to really dig into that as deeply as you would like to. Let's see, unable to detect what would have happened in the absence of the program. Right, so I think can certainly be a concern, the fact that there is no comparison or control group. But I do think we have to recognize that that's not always feasible for all evaluations. So again, all these different scenarios lay out different possible paths that you can take in order to really work towards that impact. And Jamila, the same thing, the fact that it lacks statistical hypothesis testing. I think that's a good thing and a bad thing in some ways, right? Reflecting back on the assumptions of your stakeholders, I think is so important. Something that I like to say is that your case for causality needs to be as strong as your stakeholders will poke holes in it. So if statistical hypothesis testing is really what your stakeholders are looking for and that's what they're going to trust, this approach probably isn't for you. But that's not everything, right? So just having a statistically significant difference in something doesn't answer all of the questions that stakeholders and decision makers may need to know. All right, so let's move on to our third scenario, because that goes along with a similar idea. So this scenario really departs from the first two in that it uses really qualitative data. So the primary data collection method here is asking participants through surveys or interviews. So some may be skeptical about this strategy in the context of impact evaluation, but I think it's really important to consider. So suppose someone asked you to name 3 or 4 of the most important factors that led to your current career path. Well, most of us could easily identify which experiences were the most important and which ones had nearly no effect whatsoever. So often, we really can point to the most powerful learning experiences or contextual factors that culminated in major decisions or deviations in our career path. So if we trust our own perceptions on what was important and what was not important, we should also be able to trust students' perceptions when we ask them. So this strategy really values and trusts the perspectives of participants in an intervention. It can also be helpful in identifying underlying consequences that project staff or evaluators may not have had in mind. So say we're going to survey all participants after they graduated from the college. We might want to ask a question on the survey that directly asks them about the role of cybersecurity for all in their employment path. So for example, to what extent did your internship with cybersecurity for all influence your ability to find employment in the cybersecurity sector? So this question is carefully worded to imply the cause and effect relationship. And so it starts to get some information about that, right? So I'm certainly not arguing that this question alone makes a strong argument for impact, but I am saying that it begins to walk down that path. To get a richer picture of what the role the project plays, we might decide to interview some alumni. So we identify students who participate in the program and who have been on the job market. And we might ask them, how has your choice in pursuing cybersecurity as a career path been influenced by your internship with Cybersecurity for All? So this open-ended type of question, it really allows students to identify whether or not the project had a role in their career path, or perhaps not, right? They could always say it didn't at all. It allows for a much more detailed and in-depth understanding of the connection between the project and their career path rather than just a single survey question, or even rather than just looking at the standalone employment data. So people really like telling stories, especially when it comes to their own experiences. So you might find that asking participants to tell a story about how the program impacted their career path might result in more rich information. So the question might be something like, tell me about the most significant change you saw in your career path after your internship with Cybersecurity for All. So this type of prompt comes from the most significant change approach, and it allows participants to prioritize what the most important thing to them was. It also leaves the door open for them to say that they didn't see a change, suggesting that perhaps the project didn't have the impact it intended. So we would also ask about other influences on the career path to get a sense of alternative explanations. So for that, we might ask something like, were there other significant events that impacted your career path in addition to the Cybersecurity for All project? Something else that we could do is talk to students who did not participate in the project and didn't have internships through Cybersecurity for All. This would be like a comparison group. So we could ask them, what were the major influences in your career? And then compare the patterns from these students to those students who participated in the project and see if there was a difference. So bringing these stories together in a way that paints a picture of the project and its influence on students' career path can be a legitimate design for impact evaluation. Through talking with participants, we ensured that their participation in internships came before their employment in cybersecurity, so we confirmed temporal precedence. We also paid close attention to the participation in internships and eventual employment in our analysis. So interviewing non-participants would also help to address this requirement if the results showed that non-participants were not employed in cybersecurity. And then to check off our final requirement, we asked students to identify other important factors or alternative explanations for their career path. All right, so I know this strategy is a bit different than the other ones, so let's talk about some strengths and weaknesses of these final scenarios. So use the chat box to point out what you think is either a strength of this strategy or a weakness of this strategy. Ruth says, since it's self-reported, there won't be a tendency to over-report. Yeah, I think that could actually go either way, right? Like there could be certainly over-report or under-report. So like Rui says, the participants may not tell you the truth. Certainly, there's definitely that bias in there. But Sue mentions that this is more feasible to implement, right? So when we're talking about evaluations on a smaller scale with less resources, this is certainly something that you can do much more easily than an experimental design or even gathering all of that employment data from the second scenario. So Yvette says it's pretty comprehensive. Yeah, so something I like about this design is it really gets into the nuts and bolts of how those internships affected the career path, right? So you're not just saying, yes, this project worked, but you're saying how and why it worked. Let's see. Holly says, having direct quotes from participants can make the statistics and numbers more tangible to non-statisticians. I love that. I am definitely a promoter of mixed methods when it comes to evaluation, and I think mixing those stories and those quotes with numbers just really makes things more powerful and more relatable. Yep, so Ricardo says, strength is that it explains why. A weakness is that it's not generalizable. Yeah, I think that's a really great point, this idea of, is it generalizable? And going back to who was selected for those interviews and how were they selected? And that always has practical implications because you can make the best sampling plan for qualitative interviews and it might not always work out like you'd like it to. All right. Well, thank you for all of your comments on those different scenarios. Before we move to our final question break, I just want to do a quick overview of what we've been talking about. So impact evaluation measures the long-term effects of a project, giving particular attention to the causality in the project's role of bringing about those effects. It also assesses the intended and unintended effects of that project. So I wanted to leave you with some quick and dirty strategies to take away from this webinar. So whether you are an evaluator designing an impact evaluation, a project staff, or a grant writer reviewing an evaluation plan that claims causality, you can use these 3 questions. So ask yourself, first of all, did the cause happen before the effect? Second, does the effect increase when the cause increases and decrease when the cause decreases? And 3, are there any plausible alternative explanations that could explain the change of these effects? So these questions tie back to our 3 requirements for causality, and it's just a good, quick tool to use when you're looking at things and you're either designing or reviewing something that claims causality. All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Mike for our final question break.
I'm amazed that your voice is holding up, Lissa. Very good. Here's a question for you. Go back 1 slide, because this is sort of pertaining to that slide. So before the webinar started, people submitted questions, and this one is very apropos, I think. Talking about a causal inference. How do you, and you've addressed this somewhat, but can you address it a little bit more? How is it determined reliably? For example, how do you filter out noise? And how do you deal with possible confounders when it comes to causality? You've talked about that a bit, but could you address it again? Filtering noise and dealing with confounds when it comes to causality.
Sure, I think that's a great question. I'm actually going to take a step back to kind of investigate the assumptions underneath those words, right? So when we say causality or when we say confounders, I think a lot of times there is an assumption of maybe not just quantitative versus qualitative, but an assumption of, experimental design is the best versus not. And I think recognizing that that can mean different things to different people. So if you are someone that is doing an evaluation for What Works Clearinghouse or another organization that really requires something that is very statistically valid, or your stakeholders, your decision makers are just that's the type of information that they are more persuaded by, then yes, I think you need to look into quasi-experimental designs. You need to look at regression discontinuity, matched pairs. There's a bunch of different very strong statistical designs out there that you can use in order to make that. And that will go much further into the different aspects. And I think each of those could be multiple webinars.
Sure.
But, if you could also find yourself in a situation where stakeholders are really more persuaded by stories and understanding of what's going on and a more rich explanation of those different connections. I saw recently, right here, Jamila in the comments said that, believe it or not, she finds that qualitative interviews remove a lot of the response bias because you get people telling you what you really think if they feel safe. So I think that's a really great comment to that side of the argument of saying, having these rich, in-depth interviews with people and really understanding what's going on can actually give you a different type and in some ways more information than just doing an experimental design.
Good answer. Here's another question. This came from Molly, and it's related to your number 3 on the screen. She says, if you're talking about a quasi-experimental design, not a randomized control trial in this case, but a QED, would baseline equivalence account for that no plausible explanations? Do you think that could account for it? Or are there other ways to have a quasi-experimental design work to identify impact better? I hope that question was clear.
So when we say quasi-experimental design, essentially what we're saying is that we didn't have the ability to randomly assign groups. And so that random assignment is really what takes care of, from a statistical point of view, the alternative explanations. So you're going to have to find another way to address alternative explanations, and that's done differently through different quasi-experimental designs. So there are a number of specific analyses and designs under that, and they all use a different strategy to address alternative explanations. I know that's not very specific enough because it depends on exactly which approach you're taking.
Sure, sure. No, excellent. Several questions around this topic. So let's suppose we're working for the NSF, but it might be NIH or other agencies. But for the NSF, will they accept all of these approaches that we've talked about today? Do they have a preference? Will they take qualitative things? Do they focus only on quantitative information? If you were at the NSF, what would you say that you're looking for here? Pretty broad question.
Well, as a quick reminder, we are not NSF and we don't speak
Yes.
for NSF. However, we do have interaction with NSF program officers quite frequently. And I think something that we hear is just that they want evaluations to be looking at impact. They don't require an experimental or quasi-experimental design. They don't require, particularly for the ATE program, quantitative over qualitative. But they're looking for something that goes beyond the immediate outputs, so like the counts or even satisfaction of a project. They want to know, what effect did you make? What was the long-term impact of the things that you're doing? And anything that you can do to start to show that, they will be appreciative of.
Excellent. That's an excellent point. Here's the last question. We're perfectly on time. What's the best way of communicating this impact evaluation? I know we're off topic a little bit here, but I bet you folks are thinking about it. Now that I understand the impact evaluation better, is there a suggestion you could help to report that? What's the best way of doing it?
Again, another could be multiple webinar topics in
Sure.
one. And Evaluate does have a number of additional resources on reporting, but I think back to this idea of reporting both numbers and quotes, I think has always seemed to be very strong and positive and convincing. But really also getting to your point, right? Making sure that the most not to reuse the word impactful, but the most impactful point is made up front and clearly recognized. And then all of your backings, all of your reasoning as to why you came to that conclusion is also included to give your argument strength and validity. But that can come later, even in an appendix section, right? You don't necessarily want to
Sure.
hand in a 150-page report.
Sure. You're going to limit your readership if that's the case.
Right. And consider your stakeholders and their amount of reading time for sure.
All right. Let me move us forward. Let's as we come towards the end here. Just two quick call-outs before we end this. I'd like to point out that this is a reminder to check out the Evaluate Network. It's a community for anyone interested in advancing evaluation. We can continue our conversation around impact evaluation on that Slack channel or in an upcoming web chat on December 18th, so please be attuned for those. You can find out more information on both of those activities. See the URL there under the headline evaluate.org/network, so don't hesitate to check that out. And by the way, although we've mentioned it, the slides for this webinar, along with additional resources and the recording of this live event, can be found on the Evaluate website. Everyone knows that URL by now. You can access the slides right now, but the recording generally takes us a few days to get it up there, and we'll automatically send you an email to all registrants. So this is just an amazing webinar today that you've produced for us. The examples that you use, the scenarios, you forced us to think, you forced us to write in the chat. That was really good. Now, the final thing today, if we look, we're just now 1 minute from the close of our event. I'm going to post the webinar survey. All of us are interested in evaluation. Why don't you help us by responding to our survey? Let me tell you that for most of you, maybe some older Mac machines might do this, this webinar, this survey will open in a new browser. So just go ahead and take the questions. We'll also paste the link in the chat and we'll remind you by email. So thank you very much today for being part of this event. Let's go ahead and try to launch this survey. Sorry, it's just taking me a moment here to do this. Lisa, hang on for a second. Let's see if we can do it. There we go. Oh, shoot. All right. Having a little trouble launching the survey, folks. But as we conclude, I'll keep working on it as we do it. As we conclude today, look for a message from us, and please respond to that survey. We'll send you the link. Thanks for joining us today. Lissa, thank you very much for a very informative webinar. I'll keep working on launching that survey if people will hold on for just another minute. So thank you, Lissa. Survey worked for some people. Okay, good. Excellent. Lissa, thank you again. So folks, this officially concludes our webinar. We're going to stop the recording at this point, and thanks for participating. Goodbye, everybody.